Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Elliot Levine, Research Director at the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. It's part of a series of more than 20 webinars that we're offering as part of an introduction to our symposium, which is happening on October 26th and 28th on important issues related to the field of personalized competency-based education. We'll put a link to all of our webinars in the chat box. The webinar series is a prologue, as I said, to our symposium, and so we hope you'll attend that as well and visit our website for more information. We'll also be putting a link to our symposium in the chat box. Could I have the next slide, please? So during today's webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box to help us get to know each other and learn from each other. And you could start by introducing yourself in the chat box, letting us know who you are, where you're from, maybe one hope you have for this school year. And you can also use the chat box anytime during today's session to ask questions, add comments, share insights from your knowledge of the field, and to respond to each other. You could also share your thoughts about the webinar on Twitter using hashtag Aurora2020. And we also wanted to let you know that we are recording and archiving today's webinar, and it will be available on our website within a couple days. We'll also be sending you a link when it's available, so that you, sending you an email with a link so that you can know when it's available. Can I have the next slide, please? Today, we're very fortunate to have presenters from the Learning Accelerator and Lindsay Unified School District. Beth Holland leads research at the Learning Accelerator, an organization that works on problems of practice in education. And Amalia Lopez is Director of Special Projects at the Lindsay Unified School District in California, which is one of the most advanced districts in the country in terms of personalized competency-based education. Today, they're going to be sharing the terrific research they've done to understand personalized professional learning in the Lindsay Unified School District. They've recently published a series of reports on this research, which are really valuable for the field, an unusually comprehensive look at a really high implementing school district. So we're very fortunate and honored to hear from Beth and Amalia today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amalia to get us started on the presentation.
Thank you, Elliot. Good morning and good afternoon, depending where you're dialing in from today. Beth and I are really excited to share what is an ongoing journey. It did begin 3 years ago, and we're actually still deep up in the knees to the research. So it's nice for us to show you what we've done and what we've accomplished, and certainly where we're going. Oops. To begin with, Lindsay Unified is a small agricultural community in Central California, currently very smoke-filled, and we serve a learning community of 100% free and reduced lunch. We are 97% Hispanic Latino, and notably many of our learners live below the poverty line. So the imperative for our model began in 2007, when we began to kind of tear down the walls of traditional learning, and we built what is now our personalized competency-based model, which we call the performance-based system. And the core beliefs are that all learners can learn, and that all learners have their own method and their own way, and that truly successful learning breeds more successful learning. Our learners move through competency levels. We vary that pace and path, and notably we harness data to inform instruction for our learners. And like Elliot mentioned, we have come a long way, but we consider ourselves still on this journey to move forward in a competency-based model that is truly personalized for all of our learners. And what happens is when you are building an innovative model, there's often not a lot of compasses. There's not a lot of literature about models like ours. It is a growing field, which is nice, but it continues to be a little bit limited for us related to personalized learning models. It's even more limited when you try to look at literature on professional learning. Too often that field really talks about specific technologies and platforms. It doesn't push into the space that many districts truly care about, which is how does that professional learning impact student achievement? What are the learner perceptions? How does it build educator effectiveness? And so these were some of the questions that we were grappling with, that we really wanted to find out, could we study them? How could we study them? And ultimately, what could we learn? And so in 2017, we were awarded a federal teacher and school leader grant. A core part of that grant is effective educator development and human capital management. And we knew that it presented us kind of a dual opportunity, an opportunity to first really design and implement some innovative professional learning, and second, to study it as we went, to study it along the way, to learn as we went, so we could really apply what we were learning inside of our own model, but share it with others. And so first we set the conditions, because the conditions for professional learning began by stopping the use of the phrase professional development. That carries a connotation, it carries meaning, it carries, for many educators, a negative space in their mind. So we began by rebranding about professional learning, and we really began to look at our educators and honor them as learners the same way that we do with our K-12 learners, building that mindset that we are all learners, and all learners deserve pathways and choice. So we began to build that out for professional learning. We offered opportunities that varied in depth and duration and demonstration, because what a new teacher needs is completely different than what a teacher 3 years in or 5 years in or 15 years in needs. And notably inside of an innovative model like Lindsay's personalized learning model. And so we really wanted to foster that mindset we had spent over a decade fostering in our K-12 learners, that they are learners, that they could build mastery in their own skill sets. And we really knew that it was the chance to actually find out what was working and where and how professional learning was truly having an impact on learner achievement and learner mastery of standards and learning targets. Some of the options that we offered varied from one-day institutes into innovative micro-credentials, all the way up to graduate courses and graduate degrees, because again, trying to help educators figure out what they needed and in what depth and what duration that they needed it. Our goals, we partnered with the Learning Accelerator very early on to start studying, and our goals was really to build some local context research that we could say this represents communities like Lindsay, learners like Lindsay has, and it really represents personalized models like Lindsay that could be mastery-based or competency-based, not only to inform our own district, but to inform the field and to inform effective educator development, because we can all probably agree that most teachers don't come out of credential college with all the skills that they need. So districts need a map to start to build out how do you increase and sustain educator development. And ultimately, the imperative behind all of this work was to actually get to the point where we could measure that it was having an impact on those who needed it most, which was our K-12 learners. We wanted to make sure that everything we did was a measurement of, is this actually reaching the learners? Is this professional learning impacting and growing student achievement and mastery? Because then as a district, we could pivot from that learning, we could expand what was working, and we could ultimately plan on how to sustain what was working. So let's start with a quick conversation. Beth is going to drop in the chat a Poll Everywhere link that we will use throughout our presentation today. So if you could take a minute and open up a new browser tab and pull up the poll, and we're going to start with a quick discussion about professional learning. And so I'm going to give Beth a second to drop that in the chat.
It's there.
Perfect, thank you. And when you pull up that browser window, you should be greeted by this question. How do you define successful professional learning? What does successful professional learning for educators look like to you? And you can type in any phrase that comes to mind. You'll be able to see the responses coming up in live time. And absolutely, some of the responses so far are exactly what Lindsay had in mind. Meeting our educators where they are, really making sure it could be measured in both shifts in practice and student achievement and learning, critical for us. Implementable, yes. Viable is how I think of implementable. It has to be doable. Learners feel enriched and empowered to succeed. That is so critical for our educators, because we know that when they are intrinsically motivated, they will take on any task. Absolutely. Changes in practice and behavior, absolutely. Applying learning in the classroom, thank you for sharing that. That is absolutely one of our non-negotiables. We've built out a lot of our professional learning to absolutely have to make it all the way into our classrooms and serve our learners. Yeah, embedded, sustained, differentiated, data-driven, all of these are accurate. And all of these are really were driving purposes for Lindsay, and they continue to be so. Sustainable over time in spite of changes of leadership and staff, absolutely. That's where you start to think about long-term roadmaps for professional learning. So with this common understanding of what successful professional learning is, if you could refresh your browser, and now let's answer a different question. If you were going to measure professional learning, what measures of student success would you look at? If you wanted to find out if professional learning was doing all those things that you said in the prior slide, changes in practice, impact on student achievement, all those good things, how would you measure it? You might just need to refresh your browser one time to get that new poll to pop up. Absolutely, student engagement. Artifacts of student work, definitely. Agency, engagement, and growth are all absolutely wonderful measures. Students exceed expected growth. That's definitely critical. You start to look at baselines and you start to look at where and how learners are exceeding that and what might have driven that. Aligned to learning outcomes, absolutely. Big question, yes. Value added growth model, sure. Academic, required plus expanded, absolutely. Student assessment data, classroom observations, those are two big ones that we definitely incorporated into our thinking, was that student assessment data and also those observations of teaching practice. Test scores, student work, SEL measures, lots of good examples. And so this was what was in front of us 3 years ago when we knew that we were going to build out professional learning, and we wanted to start saying, how do we know it works? And to do that, we had to first look at what is good professional learning, followed by how will we measure it? And how can that look depending on the context? And how can we find out if the learning we're building in our educators is actually making it to our K-12 learners? I'm going to move the slide on. Thank you for your poll responses. And those were our driving questions. Could we measure it? How would we know? And ultimately, could we build replicable pathways? Once we started to figure out what worked, could we replicate this? Could we replicate it so that future iterations of learners and educators in our model were benefiting and also having that same positivity and growth? So we partnered with the Learning Accelerator. We began in 2019, the beginning of our research journey, and we started small. We began by studying guided reading professional learning that we had put a lot of our educators through. And that was an easier one to measure because we could measure reading growth. And what we found was it was working. We found that the educators who engaged in that professional learning were having sustained significant impacts in student achievement and reading. Then we expanded it. We started to compare other professional learning approaches that we took. And in November of that year, we studied the impact on core area learning for our educators who had gone through project-based learning with what was then called the Buck Institute and is now called PBL Works, or had received personalized coaching from Better Lesson. We then moved into a phase of research to study what I call the measure, all of our adult competencies that were aligned to professional learning. We began to look at the construct validity and the pieces behind those to make sure they were the right measure to be using. So our research journey began small, and we've continuously begun to expand it, which is where we're going to pick up today of some of the larger things that we've learned in this journey of, is professional learning having an impact on our student achievement and educator development? And Beth, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Amalia. So I actually joined the Learning Accelerator and I jumped right into all of this in January, right after the first few reports had been written by my predecessor. So the study of guided reading, the study of Better Lesson and PBL, as well as the initial, the initial construct validity and reliability. And Amalia, I just realized we forgot the March report on the timeline. So, which is fine. I jumped in here in March to start tackling really the big driving research question behind all of this of, which professional learning pathways or combinations are most powerful for increasing learner growth. And we use that idea of pathway or combinations because, as you may recall from the graphic that Amalia showed before, there was a lot of choice. Not every educator chose the same path. Some did one-day workshops, some did master's degrees. And so we had to try and figure out like which combinations of all of these different things was having the greatest effect. Within that, it's important, we had some underlying assumptions. And we were going with the assumption that the experience that the educators were having were based on what we know from the literature as what defines quality. And so we had 4 constructs of quality, and these are actually based on a seminal study from 2001 by Garrett, Porter, Desimone, and Yoon, where they had looked at all of the professional learning that had occurred under the Eisenhower Professional Development Program, which we often refer to as, I'm now going to mess this up, Title II, right? Title II, yes. It was one of those moments where I forgot a number. And essentially what they talked about was that quality professional learning had time, right? It was linked to longer durations. It was more than the 1 hour after school fun workshop. It was really focused on a specific content area or a set of skills, something to develop. It was active. So it was not the sit and get. It involved, active participation by the educators. They were doing hands-on learning. They were doing lesson planning. There was direct observation. And then it had to be relevant. So it had to have some point that was going to directly improve their classroom performance. So we actually would like to pause here for a second. When you think about the professional learning in your district, of what you've experienced or maybe what you've designed, how might you categorize it? Because these are definitely overlapping spheres, and you can actually click and put a pin in it, put a little pin on the diagram. And just curious, where do you think your professional learning may fall within your district?
And I just re-put that link to the poll, so you just have to refresh your browser.
Thanks, Amalia. I like the pin on the outside because I'm fairly certain that when I was still in the classroom, I did some where none of these things were considered, and it was like out on the outside. But it looks like there's definitely a range. I think all of us can identify when were the times that we have actually done professional learning where it was too long or not enough. It didn't have a focus, or we weren't sure what the focus was. Whether it was relevant, whether it was active. I always think about my active learning experience. We had a parent who decided all of us in the school needed to do interpretive dance in the classroom. And as the technology teacher, I can say I used it once with a group of rambunctious second graders, but it, maybe not always the most relevant thing. So what we did with all of this is a little bit of a recap on where we went with the research. We had these underlying assumptions of quality. We were looking to address that point of which combinations led to the greatest student growth. The analysis performed is what's really been what we've been building on. So that initial guided reading study, as Amalia mentioned, was very focused and specific, one instructional strategy to one type of effect. And then it broadened, and with PBL and Better Lessons, we're comparing 2 different opportunities and looking at how did they have an effect on both the formative reading data, but also on performance in the 4 core content areas. So then I joined at analysis number 3, which was really starting to now look holistically and say, okay, what are all of the different combinations that occurred during the first 2 years of the grant? And how did, what was that effect on learner growth? And we operationalized that learner growth during that analysis number 3 as formative data on reading assessments, and then also summative data using the Smarter Balance assessment. And we looked to see which combinations had the greatest effect. We took what we found in that initial look and decided in the end to redesign again. We've taken a very iterative approach here. To looking at, okay, how are we now holistically going to analyze this 3 years worth of data? And we're taking more of a modular approach right now. where we're looking at those findings and we're trying to now determine, what does growth look like and at different content levels or grade levels, and what does it look like within different content areas. So that's where we are right now at this moment. So as someone who came in, one of the challenges that I've also often seen, and my research background is pretty heavily situated in the field of professional learning, is there's really this like, how do we get inside the black box? Because just because a teacher does some form of professional development, what is the connection to ensure that we would see some form of like student growth? It's that black box that's in the middle. And so what we did was use the different studies to start to look inside that black box. So if you hit the button, Amalia. So the first one, we looked at, educators engaged in professional learning, and the guided reading study allowed us to look at how did that show up in practice, and then what were the effects on reading growth and summative assessment. And then with the next study with PBL and Better Lesson, we were able to take another more holistic look where we looked both at what were the observable actions, there were classroom observations, what were the observable actions of educators, and what were the observable actions of learners, and then what was the effect of that in terms of learner growth. And then as we brought in more data, we were able to take more of that input-output look. So we had the first look in March where we said, okay, educators engage in professional learning. What did we see with the reading growth and summative assessment? And now where we are with these modules, which is our, did I make another tag? I think, yeah. We're looking now really at the reading growth and the content area growth. And both of these are formative growth measures. It's not just one score at the end of a year. We have multiple scores throughout each of the 3 years, so that we're really trying to statistically model what does growth look like, which I think is really helpful because we're not just trying to say, this is an input and we have this one score on which to go. We're looking at what are the curves and what are the slopes of the line. And so, we've really broken it down into, especially when we did the first look, we broke it into smaller research questions. So again, big picture, which combinations were most powerful for increasing learner growth? Then we asked the question of, okay, what about the different types, the structure of the professional learning? Like, was it a workshop? Was it an academy? Was it a master's course? We then have been using what's called a cluster analysis, and we tried to say, what were the clusters that emerged in terms of the combinations by type? And in March, we looked at it by hours, which we've decided doesn't tell us what we thought it might tell us. And so we're really focused more on type right now. And then especially with that March report, we broke it down and said, okay, now based on these clusters that emerged, what was their effect on learner growth? We also in March had looked at the effect on the specific English learner population, and we're continuing to focus on that population. So this is from our, I put these in, I believe these were from the March report. We looked at a K-means cluster analysis, which is when we determined like what emerged. And so you can see clusters, we named them 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D, meaning these were the combinations of types of professional learning that educators performed within Lindsay during the first year, and then in the cluster 2 was from the second year. Our discriminant analysis actually showed that it was, we had 5 clusters in the second year and 4 in the first year when we ran this the very first time, because you'll notice that there were more offerings that came out in the second year. The TIE courses and the site-based learning academies got added. And you can see that each cluster really had a very different composition in terms of what emerged. How many different things did they do? And this was the probability by which a learning facilitator or an educator would have performed these different, participated in these different professional learning opportunities. And then, as I said, we also looked at it by duration in that first one. And what was really quite amazing was we took the duration and we were considering everything cumulatively. So we looked not only year 1 is what happened in year 1, but year 2 is what happened in years 1 and 2, understanding that learning doesn't just evaporate after 2 years. excuse me. So when you look at the total hours completed, there's a significant amount of investment that happened by these different educators in these opportunities. And the mean duration is sort of that average across the participants within those clusters. And so, we really started to look at, what was happening and what could we see from within this. So now, based on what we've done so far, we wanted to pause and say, what wonderings or questions or ahas do you have?
We actually got one question in the chat, Beth. Can we say more about the observable actions you looked for with the educators? Would you like me to take that one?
Sure. Why don't you take that one, and I'll actually put the link to the report in the chat.
Okay. So to answer that, one of the things we were looking for, we had built observation protocols for every single learning experience that had a classroom implementation. And those observable actions were coming from a framework called the instructional look-fors, which is a set of 26 observable actions for high quality personalized learning that begins with what are we looking for in the learners, and then how does that translate back into the educator actions who set the conditions. So all of our frameworks, all of our protocols were aligned to the instructional look-fors. And in doing so, it allowed us to look for really intentional strategies by the learning facilitators and educators of where and how learners were engaged. Did we see the core competency of the instructional strategy? So we used observation protocols aligned to that framework and aligned to the instructional outcomes.
So oh wait, I copied. It would help if oh no, I did add it in. The validity study for the look-fors. And so that breaks down what those observations were and how they align to different observation protocols that the district was using.
Do you want to take the y-axis question and then I'll follow up on some of the others?
The y-axis? Wait.
On the poll, it says, what is the y-axis in the cluster graphs?
Yes. So the y-axis in the cluster graphs, the way that this worked, the y-axis is the number of that particular structure of professional learning that occurred. So when we did the cluster analysis, we built the clusters based on structure. So structure meaning, a focus institute, a learning academy, a micro-credential. And then what we looked at was we actually calculated the average number of those individual types of professional learning opportunities that occurred, which is why the numbers aren't whole numbers, because what may have happened was that a particular cluster might have included people who did on average, 2 focus institutes or 1 learning academy. So it might be that the average came out to like 1.2 focus institutes and like 0.75 learning academies, because someone may or may not have done all of the combinations. But essentially, we take all of the data and it goes into a statistical model, and we run what's known as a discriminant analysis to see if it's the best fit model in terms of the clusters that came out of it. So with that cluster analysis, we're really just looking to see what's that average participation in each type to understand what were the kinds of combinations that happened.
And one of the questions in the poll was, what were the educators' reactions of autonomy? I would offer that when we started our model in 2009, it was the same reaction from educators that we got from learners at the time. It was a little confusing for them. They maybe hadn't been empowered like that before. They were kind of like, what do you mean I'm in charge of my learning? And that was kind of a foreign concept. So one of the things we found very early on when we started offering professional learning like this was it takes continuous culture change, continuous support. If we want to honor our educators as learners, we have to consistently support them that way. And so it took a little bit of practice and change in language, because language changes culture. And so we found ourselves saying, we believe our learners deserve choice and paths to mastery. We believe you do too. And so we had to really keep re-emphasizing that the voice and the choice was theirs, and they should be working with their site administrators to co-construct goals and therefore pick their professional learning that way. And the next question that kind of relates to this is, how do we define personalized PL, and how do we break the association of seat time? That's a very hard thing to do. And I think that's a journey we'll continuously be on. And one of the things that really started to shift that mindset about seat time and just sit and get is the idea that they build a portfolio of practice. They themselves are learners, and they have to build evidence of that learning, maybe lessons plans and learner artifacts. Many of them in the micro-credentials, they were uploading videos of themselves teaching. And so we really helped them move into a vulnerable space, because in a vulnerable space, they could view themselves as learners. And that started to change how they viewed the professional learning that we were offering and how they engaged in it. And so some of those pieces kind of go hand in hand. And I don't think it's something you ever arrive at. You have to continuously build and continuously reinforce, those concepts as they, we're in a remote learning situation now. How they feel about professional learning has undergone a change just in the last 3 months. So we continue to emphasize that culture and rebuild that culture of, you are learners too, and we honor that. And Beth, I'm going to go ahead and move us on.
Actually, wait, before you do, there's the perfect question in here that is our segue. But like, how do you attribute student success to the professional learning? And I'm really glad someone asked that question, because I was asking the exact same thing. And so this also comes back to our broader research design of why we're taking the modular approach that we are right now, because we're now really starting to dig into not just this is the professional learning as an input and this was the student growth as an output, but we're really trying to understand those site-based conditions and those other, like the social conditions within the context of the learning, so that we can start to see, how did all of this come together? What about teacher retention within schools? What about leadership retention within schools? What about the learner demographics? And how does all of this come into play? Sorry, go for it, Amalia. And I will drop the link in as well while Amalia goes, because I believe you have the next one. The executive summary of that March report, which does give you sort of those initial findings, although I think I have the findings, but I'll try and multitask.
Yeah, and for all of our reports, what we did was we always did an executive summary that's a little bit more digestible. And then there's a really fun, like 70 to 90 page read if you really want the full report. So if you really want to kind of sink your teeth into it, you can read the full one. But definitely, we've just offered you that link of, in March, we really started to tackle, like Beth said, could we start tracking what the pathways could be? Because we wanted to start finding out what is really the best route of professional learning for a new teacher to our model. What is the best route for somebody who's a content specialist at the secondary level? What is the best route for someone who's trying to increase reading growth in their learners? And start to try to pin down where and how we were starting to see trends emerge. Because for many of us, our gut tells us what we believe. Our gut says they should probably do this sequence of learner and this will have the best impact. But we wanted to actually put a little bit of science to it so that we could say, now we really have some proof of what might work.
So, it was kind of a joke, but it was like 80 pages later. A couple of the things that we started to find from our March report, which again drove the way that we've pivoted at this point. So the first one was, there was not a standout. It wasn't like it was, oh yeah, everybody has to do this one thing that showed up. And it was really this idea that multiple types were really necessary. Educators engaged more than one, they consistently engaged in more than one type of professional learning. So right there, we couldn't say it was just this or just that, because everybody did more than one. And again, we went back to our assumptions about quality, and we looked at every single professional learning opportunity that the district offered, and every single one of them adhered to at least one principle of quality. So we knew they had quality, and we knew that we needed to have these multiple types. The next thing was, we really found this need for both breadth and depth. When we looked at the clusters that had the greatest growth and were more likely to have a positive magnitude of effect, in that first year, it was the clusters that had a lot of things going on. So it was depth in terms of doing lots of things, and it was breadth in terms of different types of things. And then, the last piece that we really looked at is, we recognized that, again, there's no single pathway for everybody, and that, we really needed to try and understand even more what might work for different kinds of learners, but it wasn't going to be that the district would have this like great big silver bullet.
There we go. Those findings were really helpful for us as a district, because when you learn that there is no single pathway, but you learn that you get the confirmation that certain things are working, breadth and depth are working, when you pay conscious attention to the qualities of high quality professional learning, that works. And so we started to look at where do we make pivots. We realized we did need to continue an expansive approach to professional learning. It's so critical that they viewed themselves as learners and they felt respected as learners, and that therefore what we were offering them matched it. And because there was no single pathway, because you needed breadth and depth, I think to how often districts plan professional learning at the start of the year and they think, well, we'll put on this reading training and we're going to put on this math training and that should do the trick. And that doesn't do the trick. So it confirmed for us, we had to think about what I think of as the 3 V's, which is variety, vehicle, and verification. How and what will variety look like? How will you present variety? How will it meet the needs of those learning facilitators or educators in your district? What will be the vehicles? Vehicle matters more than ever now as we live in a relatively asynchronous environment in many cases in the field. And so vehicle becomes, is it going to be a hybrid model? Is this an online self-paced experience? Is this something where they have a coach? And you start to think about the vehicle involved there, and ultimately verification. What does it look like? How do we measure it? And how do we know? How do we check and adjust? How do we continue to provide support? Because if we truly believe that all educators are learners, we know that some learners need more support even after you've taught the lesson 2 or 3 times, even after you've done some additional supports. You have that same need with educators. And so where and how will you verify? And that will let you continue to figure out how to follow up and support. And so those methods, those modes of learning and artifacts and all those observations, we knew now had to be the core of our curriculum, the core of our thinking in professional learning. And ultimately it needed to align. It should not be another thing on the side. It had to align to conversations that were already happening with their school site administrators, their principals, their building leaders. It had to align to the competencies they were already setting their goals from. And so that's one of the spaces we pushed into in this most recent year is, could we make it all come together? Could we have the breadth and depth? Could we have the choice? Could we have all these different things that we know honor them as learners? And could we make it part of their normal work? Could we make it not an extra thing, but just the main course of their work? And so where we're going now is a more modular approach, because what we learned from the larger studies in the first 2 years is we needed to dive deeper, and you can't do that in one research study. There's too many questions, there's too many factors. I've learned that sample sizes can't always attribute to what you want to statistically model. So we decided we would break things down smaller and do a more modular approaches, study little pieces now along the way that then can come together and comprehensively form the understanding we're looking for. So we started by adding in the 3rd grant year, which was the 2019-20 year, a very interesting year to study because of course we closed schools like everybody else in March. And so it makes for interesting fodder for research. We wanted to take that modular approach and we wanted to apply it to the K-8 level, notably their learning pace and progress, which kind of speaks to some of the poll responses I saw earlier on. Are we measuring learning tasks and learning targets? This is where we're going to take our first actual look at what is the impact we now see across those learning target, those standards growth, some of those things that are more influenced by authentic relevant learning tasks. And then we wanted to go deeper, like Beth said. We wanted to know, how much does teacher retention play a fact in this? How many years of teaching service come into play here? Notably our learner attributes as well, and start to dig into those clusters and the conditions of the school sites that might be informing those growths that we see or those lack of growths that we see. Moving into what we plan right now as the 4th part of the modular approach. Secondary is its own special thing. We have discovered in the research in 2 years, actually measuring K-8 is actually pretty easy compared to measuring high school. And as a former high school teacher myself, it's fun to think about the different departments and the different challenges of those educators. And so we actually have, right now, we're planning a Common Core literacy study because all of the professional learning we've put on did in some form or fashion support that they were all educators of literacy and supporting these goals of literate graduates in our community. So right now we're planning to try to dive into some kind of a literacy impact study at the 9-12 level. And then leading to this comprehensive report that just all comes together that will really encapsulate what we've learned. One of the things that runs under this entire modular approach as a current is also district investment of time and energy and even fiscal resources. where and how did we see that district investment culminating with the research on this is what proved impact, this is where we see student gains. And so trying to bring together a lot of pieces in this modular approach that will really push our thinking on where we go from here as a district.
And Wally, before I get into like what we found so far, Bethany has a question about how would you offer this type of professional learning to a really small district?
That's a great question.
Sort of
we are a small district. So our district is 4,200 learners. So I consider us small. And so what we have done is just very intentionally, there I think are two things we've done really well. We've leveraged a lot of this professional learning inside of our normal contracted PD time. The time that you normally have teachers on contract doing PD, we've just repurposed. And so one of the things is we've repurposed it. And the second thing is because of the attributes of high quality professional learning, we've split it across the year to make it an ongoing learning experience. And that has been really pivotal for us because it's not this one time sit down, get your professional learning. It's this ongoing conversation and experience that builds and lets those educators build their professional learning practice portfolios. So I would encourage leverage time that they already have allotted to PD. And I would also say, try to do it in a way that kind of spans the school year.
Thanks. Wait, go back because I didn't answer that one.
Got it.
So where we are right now is we've completed module 1 of this new approach where we asked 2 questions. We wanted to look across, as Amalia said, we looked across all 3 years. And so we re-asked, what clusters of professional learning emerged, but then we asked a second question of what are the defining characteristics within each cluster? And we had not asked that question in March. So this time around, we did a descriptive analysis of like, who's in the clusters and what do we know about them? Where it got really interesting, for example, looking at year 1 is, we had the clusters that emerged, but then we also started to look at, what were the focus areas? There was a lot of focus on ELA literacy that happened during year 1, and also realizing, and this will be important to inform the way that we look at our analyses later. So for example, cluster 1D spent more time working on ELA literacy. That was a greater percentage of the focus within that cluster. Will we see an effect of that on learners, reading and ELA performance? So that's where we are right now. What we found in year 2, what we did this time around is we kept it to 4 clusters all 3 years. And that also made the analysis a lot neater looking across. So there were more opportunities in year 2. We also had greater sample sizes in year 2. But it's really interesting how things came out. One of the ones I'm really looking at right now is cluster 2C, which on the face, the graph looks a whole lot smaller, but the items that they were doing required more time. And so we'll see how that one might pan out. And again, we can see that there's a lot of variation in terms of the different focus areas of the professional learning, especially when we start thinking about things like math and science,
And I would add to that, Beth, is that, the reason we see that heavy focus on literacy, right? The reason that we see so much more professional learning aligned to certain areas is those are district initiatives. We are a community of poverty. We are, at any given time, 49 to 57% English language learner. Literacy is really important to us. So therefore, we're continuously structuring those learning opportunities. So much of what you see in our findings also reflects that we very intentionally tried to align all of this to district initiatives.
Great, thanks. And then year 3, most of it was very few professional learning I think you had scheduled that didn't get completed because of the COVID closure. So, majority of it did occur. And then one of the things that was interesting is there was a really big shift when we look at the focus area where there was less emphasis on ELA literacy for this 3rd year and a lot more focus on what was called a motivating learning opportunity. So that might have been project-based learning or focusing on like using playlists and more of the personalized learning. So we'll see how that shakes out. So this is where we are right now. And we're gonna take this analysis and, as Amalia said, first apply it to K-8 and then to 9-12. But a few things that emerged from this. The first one was that the master's courses, and these are educators who are taking master's courses as part of degree programs. They were largely those master's courses were happening from secondary education educators. So those in the high school, not as much at the TK8 level. The clusters with the largest sample sizes had the lowest average participation rates. So those were, you know, there was a really large group that sort of did a smaller amount. It was not a surprise, but the district offered more of the focus institutes. So those, there were more highly participated in. And then again, almost reverse, but the clusters with the highest participation rates were also the lower sample sizes. And these are the clusters that I'm really excited to look at, because I'm starting to call them my high flyers. But who's the group that did a lot, and can we see an effect with that?
And ultimately, our whole intent of all of this was to apply what we know about good feedback for learners and apply it to our educators. Could we find a way to show them that they are learners too, and they could ask themselves, where am I going? You know, how am I going? And where do I need to go next? Because that idea of building a roadmap for them to work from was critical. And it was going to let us actually start to shape their mindset, but also shape those changes in practice, because we know adults don't change practice very, very easily. And so where we go next still aligns to this research. As we continue to learn, we're trying to figure out if we see those groups, like those clusters that have certain types of sample size or certain types of effects, what were the driving conditions behind some of those things? Because the thing that doesn't get talked about right now in the research totally is there's a lot of work that has to go in at the district level to put on professional learning that is high quality. And we have to meet with those consultants. We have to teach them our model. We have to get them into our language and our culture of professional learning. We had to coach them on how to interact with our educators and score and give feedback on a portfolio of practice. We had to build observation protocols. So all of these pieces, we know that once we get to where we can actually see what was working and what was generating student achievement and outcomes and increase educator capacity, then we can say, what was the work we put behind that? How do we sustain that? And how do we make that part of just kind of our ongoing experience? I'm gonna pause here and pop to the chat because I can see it popping up on the different screens. I don't think I missed any questions, Beth.
You know, if you can address this one, Amalia, of like who did you use to facilitate the different learning opportunities? And I can respond to the other one.
I would offer, who didn't we use? So I think it's a neat position to be in when you're, as a district, you can leverage a grant like we did to bring in a lot of professional learning. And so we brought in a couple of names that I'll really call out that have had a big impact on our professional learning culture. We brought in Jan Richardson's guided reading team. So we really wanted to get guided reading in place for our K-5, especially that foundational reading. So we did bring in the Jan Richardson team. Dr. Nancy Akavan at Fresno State has been an ongoing partner in literacy, working directly with our school sites, and we've seen a lot of really good impact from her work. We still continue to work with what was Buck Institute for Project-Based Learning. They now have named themselves PBL Works. Another longstanding partner that we've seen a lot of really good impact from is Better Lesson, that does personalized educator coaching, and that's very much in alignment with our model about personalized and competency-based learning. Those are some of the big ones. For science, we had a lot of success, and we would continue to use the team that comes from what's called Accelerate Learning, which is aligned to the curriculum STEM scopes. But one of the neat things about them is that their science professional learning is very much about relevant project-based science aligned to NGSS, and they partner with the National Institute of STEM. So we were able to not only offer a micro-credential through them, but our educators were able to get a STEM certification out of it. And so that was a really big motivator. So we always tried to find the right partner, that couple of things, that believed what we believe about learners and learning, that believed what we believe about educator growth, and that ultimately we're going to customize, and I can't emphasize this enough, they were going to customize their professional learning to fit within what we were trying to achieve. Sometimes PD is very canned, and the minute we would hit somebody that was very canned, that didn't want to customize to help us support our mission and vision, we would look for a different provider. But those were, I'd say, were 5 or 6 of the big ones. When it comes to graduate courses, I would say Ty out of South Dakota, Technology and Innovation in Education. They have a series of online self-paced asynchronous courses that are very high quality, and we like them so much that we even have a pipeline that we require all of our pipeline educators to do their courses as well, because those courses align to blended learning and project-based learning and learner engagement and digital learning. It's just all these really important concepts for our model. I'll let you take the other one, Beth.
So the data collection, I guess there's two separate two separate points. I know that for when there was observational data, if I remember correctly, with the Better Lesson PBL work study, it was the coaches from PBL Works and Better Lessons that did the observations. They used their observation protocol, which was then used to help validate the instructional look force and to show that there was alignment between those things. As for data collection, that has been a fascinating experience. There's been a combination of pulling data from like Google Forms where data was entered in and that came out. Amalia's colleague Abinwe is a master of spreadsheets and has provided lots and lots of data pulled from multiple sources. And then Lindsay has a project going on right now to build a large comprehensive data lake to be able to pull mass amounts at one time. So we've been, we had a small data validation study that sort of happened over the summer of trying to see how is everything coming into that data lake. But it's a lot of data. I can say I have a fabulous research assistant that has been pulling all of it together into a database for us.
Definitely a lot of data. And one of the questions in the chat also was about, do leaders participate? Absolutely. If school site leaders are going to be instructional leaders, they have to be kind of on the ground floor of what they're expecting their teachers and their educators to do. So leadership has always been part of the ongoing professional learning. We also structured special leadership professional learning. And the leadership professional learning, which we have not studied in research yet, though everything from crucial conversations to larger competencies in things like that are more behavioral and leadership processes, but we have not yet analyzed any of that in research and data science. But definitely leadership, we've expected kind of along the way that they would participate and be part of this ongoing work. I've linked in the last slide, and Beth, maybe drop the link to the presentation one more time in the chat. I've linked in the last slide just a couple of resources for you. So our website, which offers all of our research and will continue as we continue to publish our new modules, all of that research is on that Research Partnership Publications website. For those of you that want information on the instructional look-fors, that is our framework. It will continue to be our adult learning curriculum. We've built out a lot of resources for it, but that link will take you directly into those look-fors. And the link to the Learning Accelerator, who is our research partner, has just done such a fabulous job helping us broach what not a lot of small school districts of 4,200 kids do, which is take on a massive research project and try to A, learn from it, and then B, share it with the field. I see a question in the chat about student voice. That is one of our next endeavors. We would love to get into student voice and professional learning. Some of our best laid plans got interrupted by COVID-19. And so we hope to pivot and kind of return to some of those learner perceptions. Yeah. We did manage one learner perception study. It's on our page from spring of 2020 about learner perception in distance learning. So there is a learner perception study that we conducted in late spring after we had been in closure since March. So I would offer that.
Yeah, we actually, for that one, we had developed a survey instrument for Lindsay to use to really get that student voice, and then COVID hit. So we retooled that survey to be teacher facing, and then we asked the teachers to provide data on what does the student experience look like during remote learning. And we changed that survey to be both quantitative and qualitative. And I think the qualitative feedback that we got from the teachers was incredibly powerful to really help us understand how the student experience was unfolding.
Absolutely. So I think we've addressed most of the questions. If there's any last questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat. We are always happy to share what we've learned, and we'll continue to share what we've learned. It's going to be one of those things that we'll continue to learn from. And as we learn new findings, we say, well, no, what should we be looking at next? Because a truly learner-centered model checks and adjusts and measures for all of its learners, not just its K-12. It measures for its adult learners as well, and it works towards that. And Elliot, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Amalia and Beth. It's been really great to hear about the work you've done today. And I love your expression, Amalia, that you decided to put a little bit of science on it. We really need to be doing more of that in the personalized, student-centered learning space. So we appreciate your science, and we appreciate all the guidance in terms of moving us in a direction of professional learning that will be effective for teachers, leaders, learners, and everyone. So thanks so much. It's great to hear what you've been doing. And the reports are terrific too. All the links are in the chat box. and provide both a lot of information about the more data analytic parts, as well as the the more practice focused pieces. So great, thank you so much. And the slides and recording of this will be available on the Aurora website very soon. And we have just a quick wrap up for a couple minutes. If you could give me the next slide, please. That slide actually, yeah, great. No, sorry, the previous slide. We really appreciate it if you could click on the link that is in the chat box now. I think I can't see the chat box, but yes, there it is. If you could click on this link and just give us 1 minute of feedback on the session. It's just 3 questions. Your responses will be really helpful to us, and I'm just going to pause for just under a minute to give folks an opportunity to click on that and answer those 3 questions. Great, and while you're finishing that up, Amalia, if I could have the next slide, thank you. This is, while you're finishing the survey, I just wanted to share a little bit more information about our webinar series. You can see in this slide 9 upcoming webinars that we have in September and October leading up to our symposium, and you can find detailed descriptions of these on our website, as well as registration links. And in the chat box, there's now also a link to all of those. And could I have the next slide? As I mentioned earlier, our annual Aurora Institute Symposium is going to be held virtually this year on October 26th through 28th. So we hope you'll join us and visit our website. We also have a link to that in the chat box now. And next slide, please. So thank you to everyone for participating in today's webinar and the terrific engagement in the chat box and in the surveys. We invite you to stay connected with us at the Aurora Institute, and our contact information is here. And please join me again in thanking Beth and Amalia for a really terrific presentation today, and really look forward to digging deeper into those reports and learning a lot about our personalized professional learning. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thanks so much for joining us today, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.